Bleckley is a hero. It's hard to quantify exactly what he means to people because he's so lost in history right now.
Erwin is not only a Wichita hero, but he's a state hero and he's a national hero. And people in Wichita had no idea who he was or what he did. And I thought that was a travesty.
Any man or woman who's sacrificed in the cause of freedom that gets lost is a travesty.
This young man had done so many things that were so significant, not only to our city's history, but to the nation's.
He was forgotten in the city, and not a whole lot of people care.
Well, I could tell you that Erwin Bleckley was the second child of 4. He lost his older sister when he was 10, and he lost his younger brother probably when he was about 12, making him more aware of the value of life and death, I would imagine.
He's one of us. He's born and raised here. He never lived anywhere else but Wichita, Kansas.
He graduated from 1913 from the Wichita High School. He was editor of their newspaper. He was in the business office, did a lot of finance stuff because I guess he was good with math.
I mean, here's a good-looking young man. He was from a good family. His dad was a vice president of Fourth National Bank. Erwin was a pay teller. Erwin was on the path to being a very successful young man.
The girls loved him. You know, he was a good-looking young man. He had a full head of hair. You know, I don't know what happened to me, but anyway, he had a full head of hair, and that was a remark that was made in his yearbook.
He was very private young man. He was hard to get to know.
Very few people knew about Erwin's personal life. They knew about his historic life.
He was the future of Wichita. His generation was the future at that time.
When he was subject to registering on registration day that President Wilson mandated all young men register for, society was moving towards becoming involved in the war in France. When registration came along, his very best friend in the world talked him into going down and joining the Kansas National Guard.
He enlisted in the National Guard because it was believed at the time that the National Guard, being a trained unit, would be the first ones federalized and sent overseas. You wanted to go to overseas fast in this war, you went with the National Guard.
He joined the National Guard as the second person in the newly formed 1st Kansas Field Artillery that was just formed in Wichita, Kansas.
By March of 18, he was overseas already as an artillery officer. And when they started calling for observers and artillery observers to fly, he had wanted to be a pilot, but his family was, no, you're not doing that. Because at that time, being a pilot was considered suicide.
When he got to France, the Army said, hey, we're looking for observers to do this job, the job you've been trained to do, but do it in an airplane.
So he became an observer, flying, still flying, but doing what he had been trained to do.
The Lost Battalion, it's kind of misnamed. A lot of people, you say they were a Lost Battalion, and the thing that pops into your mind, even today, is a group of people that are lost, that they're wandering out in the woods someplace. In fact, that's not the case.
It was a mixed unit from about 4 or 5 different battalions that were put together under one major, Major Charles Whittlesey.
They were assigned the duties to take a particular ravine and to try to create a entrance into or break the line that Germans held.
On the afternoon of October 2nd, 1918, they managed to break through the line, get beyond a hill, and ensconce themselves in a ravine called the Charleville Ravine.
But the reason why that unit became lost is that the 2 units on either side did not obtain their objectives, leaving this particular unit out in front of everybody. The Germans surrounded them and cut them off.
And by the morning of the 3rd, they realized that they were in an untenable position, but there was no way out. They started sending pigeon messages out.
And so everybody's focus was, how do we find these guys that are hunkered down in a very dense forest?
Things were looking very desperate. Whittlesey was launching his birds with regularity, asking for help. And it was that request for resupply that made its way through the chain of command to the 50th Aero Squadron.
Number one is they have to locate them. Without locating them, you can't resupply them. You can't do anything for them.
Keep in mind, we had never done that before in military history. We really didn't have a concept of what to do.
They were going to try to actually resupply a unit from the air. Hadn't been done before.
They were taking bandages off the dead soldiers just to put it on the live soldiers to try to save their lives. They were out of everything. That's how desperate it became.
But the 50th stood up for the challenge. The mission started flying out on the 5th, and it was on the 6th, on the morning of the 6th, one of the first missions that they flew on the 6th was Dad and Black, and they went over, they dropped their packages, they tried to mark the line where they thought it was.
On their first mission, Erwin thought he caught a glimpse of the Lost Battalion. He wasn't certain, but he thought there was a chance, a high likelihood, he may have spotted him just briefly. And they took 40 bullet rounds in their fuselage on their first mission.
When he landed, he was dejected, and that he thought maybe he had spotted the guys, and he wanted to go back. So I think he talked to Harold, let's go back and try again. I think we found them, we crossed them. I want to go back to verify it.
And they came up with a plan. They would borrow a plane, go out again, and try to drop more supplies. And at the same time, if they couldn't pinpoint exactly where these guys were, then they would try to find out where they weren't by flying back and forth across the ravine and marking down on the map the hot spots where the German fire was coming from. Essentially, they were going to let the Germans shoot at them. They would mark down where the spots were, and by process of elimination, they would find out where these guys were. It was a hell of a plan.
They convinced the commander to allow them to fly back, and the commander, Daniel P. Moore, said, you guys don't have to do it. You've already done your responsibility for today's mission. Going back will probably be suicide.
Black went back to his hut and wrote out his will. It was very clear that at best they had a 50-50 chance. By this time, the fire over the ravine was insane.
But their plane was shot up. It had 40 machine gun bullet holes in it, and the mechanics deadlined it. So Harold actually borrowed another airplane. They were flying the number 2 airplane, and when they got back to the second mission, they were flying the number 6 airplane.
They packed everything in the plane, they got ready to go, and Dan Morris came up and said to Bleckley, do your best and be careful. And Black looked back and he said, we'll make the mission or we'll die in the attempt. And that was it. They took off. That afternoon, they were determined to make this mission as successful as possible, and in doing so, they actually came into the ravine. The Germans were firing down at them. That's how low these guys came in. They were only 150, 200 feet up when they came through, and they roared down that ravine, dropping packages, trying to mark down where things were.
I think that they were probably flying down the ravine, spotting the target again, dropping the packages, probably did a loop to come back up the ravine when Harold got shot.
Everything you can think of the Germans were throwing at him, So they got its major distraction, and their flight lasted about 20 minutes until Gettler was hit by a machine gun bullet in the head and he died instantly.
So Erwin, I'm sure, reacting to that, knew that something was wrong, and he took control of the airplane from the back seat.
Erwin somehow guided that aircraft with Gettler dead in the front seat, and Gettler's 210-pound body, and Gettler was 6'2" or 3", so he was a large pilot. He's leaning on that front control stick, so he's impeding the flight.
There was an observer on the ground named William Ettinger. He was an ambulance driver, an American working with the French. And he stood in front of a destroyed building and watched the entire thing and said they flew back and forth, calling for the line. Every gun in the neighborhood was firing on them.
And this airplane did a tilt, and then it did a nosedive into the ground. And we don't know whether Erwin either jumped out or was thrown out of the airplane. Now, he wasn't dead when he hit the ground. He was still alive, and there was a doctor at this French ambulance company that worked on him for about a half an hour and told the American ambulance driver, you need to get this young man to the field aid station because I can't do anything for him.
They were on their way, and Ettinger prayed the whole time. He said, this is the first American boy I ever hauled. He said, I prayed to God the whole time, let me get him there, let me get him there. They got stopped by a train at a crossing, and Ettinger got out and argued with the engineer to move the train. By the time he moved the train and they got to Villers-Dalcourt, Bleck was already dead. He had died in the ambulance. His sacrifice alone is the biggest reason to think that Bleckley should be remembered. You have a man who understood when he took off that day. There was a better than average chance he wasn't coming back.
Erwin's heroism, it was earned with premeditation and deliberation because he had thought through these scenarios before the flight.
They knew, they had to have known that they were going to be killed.
Of course, it's a Medal of Honor awardee, and those guys, they went above and beyond, but I don't think I've ever talked to a single one of them that hasn't said the same thing. I just did what needed to be done at the time. And I'm sure that if Bleck had survived, he would have said the same thing. It would have been something that just happened that day. They needed to do it, and it got done. I think that as a society, we forget sometimes that these are just regular guys who reached above and beyond because it's what needed to be done.
But I ask the question, why isn't Wichita doing something more? What have we done for Erwin? What have we raised up to remember Erwin? And I would applaud everything that's been done for him, but there is a street named after him.
What have we done for Bleckley? Well, we named a street for him in 1932, which floods a lot. It's a very low-lying area. And we put a monument, an obelisk up for him, which was near Kellogg until the flyover was being built in the early 2000s, and they relocated that on the southwest corner of the VA.
Each generation has their own way of telling stories. And we are in a time where our society is such that we have cell phones, we have 1,000 different things that can distract us. And so telling his story in a meaningful way to the generations that exist now is much different than it was when he initially died.
If we don't tell others about the good things about our state, about our city, and about our people, who will? Somebody's got to do it.
I visit Bleck's grave every time we go over to France. The sense of loss is acute, but most of all, there's a melancholy that goes along with it because we should know these names. These names should be inscribed, should be told, should be talked about, and they're not anymore. And that's a travesty that they would be forgotten, that their sacrifice just 100 years later is forgotten.